Hello, I'm Kevin Barrett of Truth Jihad Radio. I can say whatever I want and bring on guests who say pretty much what they want to say, thanks to listeners like you who subscribe by way of the subscribe at Substack button at truthjihad.com. Welcome back. This is the second hour of Truth Jihad Radio, right here at revolutionradio.com. Also broadcasting on noliesradio.org. That's where the archive shows up, and also at the UNZ Review, unz.com. And maybe some other places, too, every now and then. I don't put these shows on YouTube much anymore because I just get my channel frozen, because somebody is always likely to say something that's not exactly what the mind control mavens approve of, and particularly it's that medical misinformation bugaboo that gets us frozen and censored. But I've had other radio shows censored for all sorts of reasons, and that's why it's not on YouTube so much anymore. Anyway, let's talk about geopolitics. That was a fun first hour, but we shied away from geopolitics with Daniel Pinchbeck. He admitted that's not really his forte. My guest this hour, Matt Ehret, is very much at home in talking geopolitics, and I invited him on to talk about his three-part series on anti-China psyops. Well, it's titled Debunking Anti-China Psyops. You know, a lot of folks, including people like Daniel, feel that China is kind of threatening, and the top levels in China are working with the bad guys elsewhere in the world. And that's, in some cases, there are even people in our so-called alternative sphere who are hardcore sort of new Cold War cheerleaders and total China bashers. But Matthew Ehret is definitely not one of them. So let's talk about that issue from his point of view. Hey, welcome, Matt. How are you?
Hey, Kevin. Always great to be on.
Yeah, good to have you back. So very good series. And I think you're a kind of a balanced and reasonable voice on this question of what's up with the seeming new Cold War with China. But how would you respond to somebody like Daniel Pinchbeck, who in the first hour said that he kind of suspects that at some level there's collusion going on at the top levels between the West and China, and he thinks China is up to its ears in COVID and other shenanigans, and that, you know, we're no longer in a world of sovereign nation states, that the top level, they're very likely colluding, including colluding on this dystopian project, the Great Reset and all of that. So how would you respond to that point of view?
Well, I think that my approach is to try to look for the nuance. I mean, a lot of people tend to make very polarized, absolute judgments about things without taking the time to fully appreciate the context of the historical dynamics, the struggles between sets of ideologies. And there's no country in the world that is not untouched by its own deep state apparatus, right? The United States, and that was the topic of our last conversation, is not just one behemoth thing, and that was the subject of my recent book series as well on the clash of the two Americas. There's obviously something historically based upon something good going back to 1776, which is anti-imperial, fundamentally in alignment with an idea that law must be in harmony with the true nature of a creative species made in the image of a loving creator. And all great presidents, there's many great presidents who die while in office, and if you look at their policies and what they're fighting for internationally, you'll find the same sort of positive aspect of the U.S., which there is this other Anglo American imperial thing that has recently become known as deep state, whatever, shadow government, whatever you want to call it, which is has been trying to essentially impose its own ideology onto the world, using the U.S. as a sort of dumb giant to crush the weak. China is no different in the sense that there's a battle throughout its own history, and I think by appreciating some of those dynamics, you can better look at what Xi Jinping is actually dealing with, and that came out in my trilogy. Which, I mean, part of the reason why I wrote the trilogy is I'm in a weird position where, about half of the audience that comes to my websites are they tend to be American patriots. They recognize that there is a great reset depopulation agenda that's underway to destroy their society. And they also tend to be very anti-Chinese. There's just a lot of psyops that's out there across conservative media to sort of spin and frame all information to make it seem as though China is the big bad supervillain, ignoring the fact that when you look at who actually has been trying to destroy China for hundreds of years, what power structures, you'll find that they're the same power structures that have been trying to destroy the United States, or the better part of the United States, for that same time. And then the other half of my audience are pro-Chinese, pro-Belt and Road Initiative people who tend to be very anti-American, right? So here I am sort of trying to figure out what is my role, and my wife, Cynthia Chung, who is a co-author, is in a similar position where we're trying to figure out how do you help educate people to the real nature of the game and how we're being played to ultimately give our consent to a third world war by going along or drinking this anti-China Kool-Aid.
Okay,
but China has
it's
its own deep
interesting,
state,
Yeah, the people in the alternative sphere are drinking the anti-China Kool-Aid, and that it kind of reminds me of the way that some of them were also drinking anti-Muslim Kool-Aid, not increasingly as time went by after 9/11. The kind of Alex Jones crowd and Paul Joseph Watson and people like that. How do we help those people cool off a little bit and drop that xenophobia?
Well, I try to wield my facts. I approach things from the standpoint of history always to just get across what are the historical dynamics. And there's some fun paradoxes for these people. Like, for example, the fact that George Soros said openly in a 2020 Davos speech that the two greatest threats to his open society were, number one, Donald Trump's USA and Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. And this was the same moment that the China-U.S. trade deal, the first phase, where China was going to buy up $350 billion for phase one of the reindustrialization policy of the U.S., because Trump was trying in a certain way to rebuild American manufacturing that had been hollowed out over 40 years of globalization. But that idea of a U.S., China, and also Russia alliance for common projects that would be in everybody's interest was something that has always scared the hell out of a lot of these very evil players that George Soros represents. And when you look at George Soros, not only was he a part of an operation to try to destroy China throughout the 1980s while he was doing the same thing with various liberalization, privatization projects in Russia. He even had one of his key operatives who became the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party in the 80s. And that guy's name was Zhao Ziyang. And he ran a think tank with George Soros directly. And he was the head of China, right? That was a very high-level control to bring in a depopulation agenda. And in 1989, Soros was kicked out. They just, the Chinese intelligentsia realized how they were being set up to be destroyed. They put down their color revolution in 89, and Zhao Ziyang was put under house arrest. Many of his allies, his co-conspirators, were arrested. Many of them fled to the United States with the help of triads in Hong Kong and MI6 and CIA. That's openly acknowledged as part of Operation Yellowbird. And they became sort of a deep state in exile, continuously running operations in the same way that the Russian oligarchs that were kicked out by Putin went all to the United Kingdom, where they've set up operations to run all sorts of various cultural warfare and literal color revolutionary operations against Russia from safer sanctuary in Britain. So I try to get across what is the actual structure of evil, where is it located, and when you frame things, because I think a lot of the people like Paul Joseph Watson, or many of the people who are susceptible to the Epoch Times sort of analysis, they tend to think of China today as it was in 1966 to 76 under the color revolution run by the Gang of Four. So they're just transposing these past dynamics onto the present situation, and they don't realize that it's not really nation states that are running the show. And it's not like China has that character anymore. China has been recovering for 50 years from the destruction that was done in that cultural revolutionary period, which was its own great reset. Yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah. Speaking of Soros seeing Trump and China as the big two threats to the open society, what is that open society vision of his? On the surface, it claims to be a certain philosophical commitment to it. It's a certain kind of liberalism, I suppose. And I guess he would claim that his problem is with strong states that are going to repress individuals and the freedom of people to do what they want, think what they want, spend their money, invest their money as they want. So it's basically a form of liberalism, and yet you say he's also a depopulationist. Now, if you were going to try to depopulate the planet, obviously you would have to have huge powers of social control. You couldn't just let things go happily, under liberalism, letting people do what they want. So how do you sort of reconcile Soros as a control freak villain on the one hand, and as an open society liberal guy on the other?
No, there's no contradiction at all. You first got to look at George Soros's affiliation with Karl Popper, he was sort of the founder of Open Society. He wrote a book called Open Society and Its Enemies at the London School of Economics, which is a Fabian Society school. Soros, after he, had the best days of his life working for the Nazis, which is what he says in an interview in the 90s, that really made him the man who he was, right? So he was talent searched. People saw and liked his sociopathic character. And he fell under the sway for about 6 years at the London School of Economics of Karl Popper. And this is sort of what shaped the role he was to play throughout life. When he came out of that school, he became the founder of the first real modern hedge fund called Quantum Management. And that was set up with seed money from Evelyn de Rothschild in 1968, which became part of a coterie of what became, effectively mercenaries of the consumer society era. So after the U.S. dollar, after the U.S. dollar was floated from the fixed exchange rate system that was part of the former industrial economic model that had run society for a long time, the U.S. dollar was separated from real productivity and floated onto speculative, floating exchange rates. And with that deregulation of the system, there was a new type of game in town of an empire masquerading by free trade ultraliberalism, but with the overarching agenda to just decapitate all nation states. Because, under liberalism, under globalization, under the World Trade Organization, you're not allowed to do protectionism. You're not allowed to protect your people from the markets. You have to just sort of let your sentinels down and let the speculators do whatever they want to maximize their profits. And that became the tool to destroy third world countries and bring them under the control of a supranational hegemon above the power of nation states. It also included hollowing out the United States itself by turning the U.S. into a consumer society cult basket case, right, which could not produce for itself anymore. So Soros always played a very big role at destroying nations who were belligerent or prone to nationalist tendencies by speculating against their currencies. He did that well throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s. And basically, if you look at Karl Popper, part of this, Soros himself, the Open Society Foundation was set up in 1979. That was the same year that Kissinger, Kissinger, the Club of Rome, all these different freaks who really opened up the door to this new model where China was supposed to become the producer of the rest of the developed world. The Chinese were gonna remain poor forever in Kissinger's mind and in Soros's mind, and they would just produce cheap stuff. They would have a small rich class, and the masses would never get wealthy enough to buy what they make. And we would never make what we consume. So nobody would be really independent. And so Open Society was created in 79. And the idea with Soros, and you could see this with his Institute for New Economic Thinking. It's a think tank he created in 2007. It was tied to the Chatham House groups in London. It's partially Oxford-based. It's designed effectively to promote a two-tiered society. In Soros's worldview, you need to have a world with maximum illusion of democracy and freedom for the majority of the slaves of the earth, who will have the illusion but not the reality of democratic power. So that means basically convince everybody that their freedom is in their hedonistic license. It's not really true freedom, because true freedom is tied to your conscience and your ability to develop your full potentials as a citizen, not just be a hedonistic beast. So the idea of the Soros version was, okay, give people local mini hedonistic senses of freedom and local mini democratic sensibilities, that they could have local control over whatever little mini part of the world that they were a part of. But the actual real levers of control would be always in the hand of the social engineers managing the system from the top down. And if you look at, again, people like, or even his theories of, Soros has a theory of reflexivity, and he's utilizing, as is Karl Popper, certain ideas of the Copenhagen School of Quantum Mechanics that utilizes the model of stochastic gas theory to shape their idea of politics and governance. So if you have for example what do you call it, a spray can of gas molecules that you heat up, the gas molecules will, as it gets hotter, move around more and more and more until it blows up. And as the gas can blows up inside of a room, you'll have at the very beginning of the blow up a lot of activity, a lot of potential. Molecules will be hitting each other. But as time moves forward on the timeline, you'll have less activity, higher degrees of entropy, less potential for change as things move into equilibrium. They see human beings, the masses, as gas molecules moving stochastically without a higher principle of identity governing them, which would normally be what a healthy human being is fed off of through their faith, their religion, their love of family, their respect for their elders and their children, their love of nation, nationalism. These are principles that tap us in as individuals that are mortal into a higher continuity of a species that we're a part of, which gives us a love and a desire even to die if need be, if it defends a deeper principled cause or the health of our soul or conscience. We will do things that are not predictable, the way a lower hedonistic beast who's just perpetually afraid of their mortality will tend to live and shape their identities. So Soros has always been sort of a part of that crowd. You could see it based on the power structures he works with, the sophistical operations that he is. I mean, just look at his funding of different sorts of color revolutionary movements all across the Georgia, Ukraine, Philippines, his work with, or even the United States. Look at his work with Dominion Systems and Lord Mark Malloch Brown, who runs Smartmatic, that did a lot of work to initiate a color revolution inside the United States, or his work in founding the International Crisis Group, which creates all of the on the ground reporting of crisis areas like Iraq or Syria or Libya or Yemen or wherever, that is then used as documents by international governments, NATO, to bomb countries like they did in Iraq or in Libya. Look at his role in the International Criminal Court that's used to justify why leaders like the Sudan's Bashir is bad and evil and this country should be carved up, which is what Susan Rice did, working with Soros and Mark Malloch Brown. So you just look at what they're actually doing over what they're actually saying, and you start seeing what they're a part of and what their real agenda is beyond the nice words of freedom and anti-authoritarianism that they blather about. It doesn't mean anything.
And certainly this billionaire class, of which Soros is a leading member, doesn't really seem dedicated to preserving freedom in the West. On the contrary, whether or not they're gearing up for war with China, and I think they are. Daniel Pinchbeck wasn't so sure in the first hour. But whether or not they are, they're certainly happy to use ideas from China as well as from anywhere else, and their own ideas as well, to roll back freedom in the West.
Yeah.
And so you in your piece on China and your debunking of anti-China psyops point out that the Chinese system, which you don't, of course, fully go along with in terms of its approach to freedom of expression and religion, is seems to be, well, you don't put it this way, but as I read you, it's that those aspects of the Chinese system are the lesser evil compared to what these banksters are trying to do in the West and actually what trying to do worldwide. And so what are the reasons why Chinese social credit and regulation and or repression of religion are a lesser evil than what the Western banksters are doing?
Well, yeah, you got it. I mean, China itself is a friend of mine made the point not that long ago that we'll never really know what China would have been had they not been the target of color revolutionary tactics over the past decades. The thing today is that China is trying very much to survive. It is part of an international alliance with Russia, very closely integrated with other countries too, working to create an alternative system known as the multipolar alliance, founded upon a totally different operating system, a different paradigm of value, a different idea of win-win cooperation. It's a different world of thinking, which is much more in harmony with how human beings actually will have a common interest in the future. So China is, if you look at their history, there has been an effort to carve them up with CIA and other MI6 and other intelligence agencies that have sponsored radicalization movements of Islamic groups in Xinjiang, which has a border. China has a border with Afghanistan, We know that throughout the 1990s into up to the year 2014, there were well over 100 cases of terrorist activities inside of China with radicalized groups, just like there were across the Middle East, which is largely the effect of people like Zbigniew Brzezinski having, played the Islamic card against the Soviet Union and funding radical groups, madrasas in Afghanistan and in Pakistan with the help of the Saudis for a very long time that created the foundation for what became later known as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So China has had to deal with it, but they didn't deal with it by bombing a country back to the Stone Age. They've had to deal with it in their own way, which is it's a breath of fresh air compared to what we've got, because they're doing economic development, they're doing trade schools, training, things like that. And for those who say that you're not allowed to be a Muslim in China, there's 24,000 mosques, for Christ's sake, in Xinjiang. It's a higher per capita rate of mosques than I think anywhere else in the Western world. And they're providing trade schools in a lot of these so-called re-education camps. I mean, they're providing, civics classes, language, history, trade, and they're giving people opportunity to work and create a better life for themselves. So that's very different from, again, look at what we've done by destroying the vital infrastructure of countries that didn't even have anything to do with 9/11, or, look at what we've done by putting so many Muslims without trial or jury or anything into Guantanamo Bay, even our own people who have whistleblown. There's so many cases, from Daniel Hale to Chelsea Manning to so many people have just blown the whistle on U.S. abuses and murders of civilians and found themselves facing now prison time. Assange being another one, right, in his own way. So China, there's no actual situation where you cannot practice religion in China. The thing is, though, and China even has it in their constitution, that religious freedoms are protected. It's just that you have to have a license from the state to operate one of the official churches, which is Protestant, Catholic denominations. You have Muslim, same thing, Buddhist temples, because there has been, for over 150 years, tons and tons of examples of Western intelligence agencies utilizing the cover of missionary operations to fuel the dissolution of China, going back to the Taiping Rebellion, which was a Christian led civil war using a synthetic Christian cult created by Jesuitical missionaries inside of China in the 1840s during the Opium Wars that killed 30 million Chinese, and that's still a very big wound and a memory that they're living with. And NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, CIA, which is a CIA operation, and the actual head of the NED has even said that the things we do today are the things that the CIA has always done covertly, and we just now do it officially. I don't like their social credit stuff, and if you listen to people like Kissinger or Soros speak well of China, you'll find that they're always speaking well. Specifically, the only thing that they like is social credit and centralized command structures. Now, the reality is, I could see why it would be justified, because the world is run by not nation states, but a supranational oligarchy that wants to get rid of nation states, get one world government, and reduce the world population under a, COP26 type Green New Deal Great Reset, which is what China has, by their actions, completely opposed on so many levels. So if you judge, like they say in the Bible, right? You judge me you judge them by their fruits. In terms of like how will you know whether somebody's a false messiah or not in the future? And I'm not saying China's a messiah. I'm using just a metaphor here. But you judge people by their fruits of their actions. China is building the types of big projects, creating cadres of people who are trained across Africa with skills to be engineers, building full spectrum economic systems across Kenya, Nigeria, every country that they do business with. They're actually doing honest business and increasing the knowledge base and economic sovereignty of these countries, working with the BRI. And they're funding it through national banks that are not privately run central banks. That was one thing that George Soros failed to do, which unfortunately was successful in Russia in the 80s under Gorbachev and Yeltsin, was that they created private central banks. They got rid of Glass-Steagall bank separations between commercial and investment banking in Russia. And in China, it's the only country in the world that has maintained control of state banking, can emit long-term credit, productive credit, and has maintained a separation between speculation and investment banking. So unfortunately right now, they've had to keep a certain amount of control on these operations, and there's a lot of them. And I don't like social credit, and I know that's what Kissinger likes. Yeah.
Specifically, why do they need social credit to protect their state banking system?
Oh, that's different. I'm just saying that's sort of more of the contextual stuff I'm putting out there. But in terms of their national integrity as a nation from all of the different forms of deep state apparatuses, the different networks that are tied to foreign intelligence agencies, there's a variety of things that are trying to turn the state and turn different clusters of people within the state into, destabilizing forces. So part of the social credit thing, and it is that one, its primarily target is the more corrupt part of the elites amongst the Chinese deep state, which is huge. They still have a big chunk, and it's called the Shanghai faction around the former president Jiang Zemin, who people like, for example, Jack Ma, if you want to know what he comes out of, it is this Shanghai faction of many billionaires, because the Shanghai and a lot of the Pacific coast of China has a very rich per capita economic base. A lot of these forces got their power by working with Western financier interests. Jack Ma is a member of the World, Economic Forum. He's a trustee, and he was essentially leading a bit of a coup inside of China, with his speech calling for a complete transformation of the Chinese banking system towards something post-industrial. Anyway, there's a lot of elites that if you just give them a ticket for doing things that are illegal, they have so much money that they don't care. But if you say, okay, well, you're not allowed to travel on, high-speed rail trains by doing the things you've done, or, for example, your children will not have access to these elite schools, then that's a real incentive for a lot of them to get into line. So in that sense,
so social credit is actually kind of working to prevent the upper middle classes and some of the upper classes from totally antisocial behavior?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's a way of behaviorally getting a leash, transforming the behavior of the more dangerous parts of the elite. And also for people who have been getting money, as the Chinese government generally looks away. They turn their shoulder, because there are a lot of Christians. There's like 50 million Christians. There's a lot of underground churches, and most of them, they don't care.
Yeah, Matt, I'm losing you for a second here. Not sure if I'm still broadcasting. Okay, You're back. Sorry, you cut out for a second.
Oh, okay. So I'm just saying, like, a lot of these groups do tend to get provably money transfers from Western intelligence agencies, like China Aid is a big one tied to the NED. And for those that are receiving money, that's part of the Chinese constitution is no religious group shall be subject to control or financing by foreign forces. Or that disrupt the public order. They will not be allowed to engage. You will get a lower social credit score if you find yourself participating in something that smells like color revolution. You can also get out of your social credit too. Like, you can recover pretty easily in China versus, let's say, I make this point in my articles, that the type of similar things that we already have here are very difficult to get out of, right? Just being at a January 6th protest on Capitol Hill has gotten people in prison on forever do not no-fly lists, or are just perpetually now unhirable in the West. Or if you go bankrupt because COVID has shut down your bank, your economy, not your bank, sorry, your economy, your business, and you've gone bankrupt, it's nearly impossible for so many people to get out of having that type of terrible credit that will prevent them from accessing a mortgage.
If you're a professor and you're pushed out of the university by politicians for being a 9/11 conspiracy theorist, it's going to be very hard to get rehired again in the American Academy, I can tell you. So there is
you're not alone, right?
Credit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's more formalized, though, and it's more systematic in China. What are the kinds of things that actually go into the average person's social credit score?
Oh, there's a lot of variables, and there's not like one single model. There's many dozens of models being applied to various parts of China. For the most part, there's a tendency towards like if you've not paid your a ticket, you're derelict on paying a fine or a ticket, that will reduce your social credit score. You're smoking in no smoking areas
like
or something.
Credit reports in the West.
Yeah, kind of. It's yeah. I mean, there's a whole myriad of things, but I mean, and I'm sure that there are excesses. I'm sure that this is not like, I wouldn't go out and defend it. I don't like a lot of aspects of this, but it's not as bad as people think it is at the same time too. And as long as you're not doing anything which is again tied to international oligarchical operations in any way, then you're generally good. So overall, it's that we go back to the oligarchy. There is a provable oligarchy. Most people who fall for the anti-China stuff, they just haven't taken the time to fully understand what is the Anglo American oligarchy really? What is its agenda, its operating system? How has it moved over the past century or centuries? Because it's one continuous function that is active everywhere, and it's ultimately still afraid of the thing it was afraid of when 1776 happened, or when FDR was trying to work with his Chinese and Russian counterparts to create an anti-imperial world architecture of win-win cooperation founded upon big development projects, which was subverted by his early death and the rise of a new Rhodes Scholar, Anglo American crowd that took control of U.S. policy with the British, and that ran roughshod over the world for the next, what is it now, 75 years, 80 years? So it's just getting a better grasp of this history helps so much to really get a sense of like where's this thing coming from? What is China dealing with in that sense?
Right. Well, you mentioned the history of the Taiping Rebellion and the way that religion has been used by outside powers to divide and conquer China. We see religion being used that way today in the Muslim world. I've recently been on Press TV and on this radio show, actually, debating the issue of to what extent Daesh or ISIS is, in fact, a Western divide and conquer operation from the get-go. And with regard to China, there's Tibet with its religious nationalism. There's Xinjiang with its religiously infused nationalism. And then you could even argue that in Taiwan, there's a kind of a religion of Western or cosmopolitan liberalism, kind of an anti-Chinese mindset that's a little bit like a kind of a local nationalistic religion as well. And it looks like Taiwan is the hot spot right now. Daniel Pinchbeck in the first hour said he didn't see, he thought there was virtually no chance of a hot war between the U.S. and China. I'm not so sure, and maybe you could reflect on that and on the sort of religious ideological factor there.
Oh yeah, no, I don't know. I really liked. I looked at some of his work on cultural commentaries, and I think it's really good. But yeah, I don't know how he's missing this, but no, the fact is that China's backyard is replete with U.S. military operations, and this is a reactivation of Obama's Asia pivot strategy to a very high degree. I mean, the U.S. operates something like, what is it, 20,000 troops in South Korea. They're setting up a THAAD missile shield in South Korea. In Japan, there's like 50,000 troops. The Philippines is restarting their U.S. Military agreements, running all sorts of operations as well with the U.S. Japan, big time as well. And the U.S. is continuously running war games, all sorts of military warships passing through disputed waters of the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits as well. The Canadian ships with the U.S. battleships have just already provocatively moved through Taiwan. And I think I know it's been recently admitted by the Chinese government that they have had dozens of U.S. Special Forces operatives training the Taiwanese military.
Yeah, they're starting to admit that now, and they're saying and doing things that seem like they're really strong provocations.
And it's part of clearly the operational doctrine of what was known as full spectrum dominance, and this is tied to the anti-ballistic missile shield, which was begun by Dick Cheney around Russia's perimeter as NATO expanded, and this is again thanks to Soros in many ways, with a lot of his operations and his democracy movements throughout the 1990s in the post-Soviet space, putting in local deep state operatives throughout what were formerly Warsaw Pact countries that then begged to be a part of NATO. And in each one of these countries, there was the expansion of U.S.-funded primarily military systems and missiles that could be converted to an attack mode very easily to destroy Russia's response capability under a nuclear first strike. China has had to deal with now the same policy around its perimeter. It's all one singular policy because China and Russia have a strategic partnership of survival with other countries joining that new system. So indeed, like Taiwan and Hong Kong and Tibet and Xinjiang are the four weak spots that there's been a maximum amount of effort to capitalize upon any type of regional, ethnic, or other differences within these areas to amplify chaos and to provoke separation movements. I mean, just quickly jumping back to Xinjiang, people forget that the groups that fought with ISIS, the Chinese radicalized Muslims that have been radicalized in Xinjiang, fought and cut their teeth working with ISIS in Syria and in Iraq. And, China's had to deal with that. They're part of the East Turkmenistan.
Isn't it funny how ISIS is always actually doing the dirty work of the empire?
Absolutely. And I don't know whether the people receiving the money and the logistical support from the Western imperialists who are in ISIS, they just think of it as like, oh, Allah works in mysterious ways. I don't know how they justify that. Or are they just themselves like, covert Satanists? Maybe they are. I don't know. All I know is, that's very ironic, and they have a separatist movement to create. They don't see Xinjiang as a province of China; they see it as the East Turkmenistan, nation. There is CIA sponsorship going back to the 50s with weapons and other things for the Dalai Lama radical extremists, including the Dalai Lama's own brother, who was a very violent reactionary separatist receiving CIA money, and this is openly admitted by CIA documents that one can read online even today.
That's an interesting story many people don't know. So how, did the Dalai Lama maintain close relations with this brother?
Yep. He never cut off relations or anything. He was always a part of this operation, maintaining himself a sort of peaceful appearance only, kind of like Soros. It's all about appearance, but protecting a very radicalized, very violent movement. And that's why he's not allowed back in China. It's not that he's like China just doesn't like Buddhism. Tons of Chinese are Buddhists. They have no problem with that. They don't like separatist movements that are funded by the CIA.
But let's quickly say that when you talk to the people who support these separatist movements, the points that you hear, and I did have one Uyghur woman on she was working with an NGO and obviously sort of cooperating with the empire in trying to push back against China. But these people argue that there's a kind of Chinese, call it a replacement almost, like the Americans were afraid of being replaced by immigrants. Well, the people in Xinjiang see a lot of Han Chinese immigrants coming in. So there's an ethnic issue here as well as the religious issue. So they feel like their culture is being swamped and wiped out by this Han Chinese culture, which they see as a very different alien culture. And they would kind of prefer to have some control over their borders and not have so many people coming in. And they would like to be able to do what they want. And I'm sure the Tibetans feel the same way.
From everything that I've seen, was she actually based in Xinjiang, or was she based in Turkey or something like that, or Germany?
She was in Canada.
She's in Canada, yeah, okay. That's what I'm noticing. Like, a lot of the most vocal people who express these opinions actually are not based in Xinjiang itself, because there's hundreds of videos you just see on the ground of like life in Xinjiang, and now that terrorism has been wiped out effectively. There's completely transformative processes of economic development and harmony. I mean, people are really happy that there's this new future awaiting them, including there's interviews with tons of people both in Xinjiang and tons of interviews with locals in Tibet. You see there's now hundreds of community centers and performance centers where they are cherishing their language. They're not losing their language at all. They're still teaching that in their schools. They're teaching their dances, their traditions. You can go and see them performed all over the place easily. So there's a real celebration. There's of their natural, historical, cultural values, as well as also learning Mandarin and Chinese history and other things too. There's a harmony of different interests that are working quite nicely under economic large-scale projects of development. It's transformative, and I think that scares the hell out of a lot of the people who run things like the World Uyghur Congress, which is a German-based organization openly getting money from the National Endowment for Democracy, and that's been admitted to by the head of the organization. Many of these groups have found support, or at least protection, in Turkey, which I think up until recently has been playing a bit of a dangerous dual game in the New World Order, trying to sort of walk in both worlds, which is not very wise. But still protecting a lot of these groups who are then using it as a launch pad to run anti-China propaganda from Turkey, which, for much of the time during the civil war in Syria, Turkey has been a major supporter of ISIS groups masquerading as the Free Syrian Army, buying up their oil and things like that. That's since reduced quite a bit since Fethullah Gulen launched his attempted coup with the CIA. Fethullah Gulen is kind of like one of these weird cultish billionaires who receives protection, lives in the U.S. in a compound, just like the head of the Falun Gong, which runs Epoch Times. What's his name? Li Hongzhi.
Yeah, that's an interesting parallel, isn't it?
Yeah, very, very much so. And both of them seem to have, Fethullah Gulen, I got to do a little bit more work on it. You probably know more than I do, but it does seem to be tied to certain British Freemasonic networks that were active in the 1920s and earlier in the Ottoman Empire.
That's entirely possible. Yeah. Yeah,
it seems, it just smells of it everywhere I look. I have to get my mind around it a little bit more, but definitely Li Hongzhi is it's like an Asian Scientology cult. The guy who heads Falun Gong, it masquerades as like this nice Qigong exercise group that preaches compassion and tolerance and forbearance. But when you actually look at this guy's history and you look at what he thinks personally in direct interviews, he thinks he is sort of like a messiah character organizing a battle of interdimensional UFOs and aliens, that he's personally responsible for managing this gigantic sci-fi thing, which is something like out of an L. Ron Hubbard wet dream.
That's kind of cool. I don't really see any exposés about that in the Epoch Times. I don't even see him editorializing about that.
I think they're a bit embarrassed by the guy, frankly, so they try to keep him in his 400-acre compound in New York. But yeah, it's a huge umbrella organization, and there's a reason why China kicked out this nut job in 97, and the amount of influence that he has with his, he I mean, I think he's a puppet, but I think that his organization represents a very, very powerful cultural warfare op and psyop, which has, it runs popular dances that are all over the world, and that are featuring the Chinese always as the Communist parties trying to destroy the beautiful Taoist, civilizational traditions. And there's all this like subtle messaging. But the Epoch Times is probably their most useful and dangerous tool, because I like a lot of the Epoch Times coverage of like the nefarious stuff going down by the great resetters inside of the United States or George Soros. They're pretty good at that, and that's what makes them so attractive. But then when it comes to foreign policy, now they have you looking through a fucked up lens of sorry for the language, by the way. I shouldn't do that.
Oh, yeah, you put a nickel in the swear jar.
Yeah, I will. But they have you then looking at the world from the standpoint of how Steve Bannon thinks, through the mind of Steve Bannon.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison too. Yeah, but with Fethullah Gulen, there's a lot of basically good stuff going on there, which is Turkey's preservation of its Islamic heritage by way of Bediüzzaman Said Nursi. There have been many of these Nursi groups that have grown up in Turkey, and Fethullah Gulen became the leader of one of them. And he's pro-Sufi, which I think is good. The Sufis were brutally persecuted under Ataturk in his vicious cultural genocide of Turkey. And so the fact that there are all of these people celebrating Fethullah Gulen, Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, including Gulen's group, is in itself a positive thing as far as I'm concerned. It's sort of in the same way that I would think, preservation of Taoist heritage in China would be a good thing. And I would actually lean more towards ideologically sympathizing with Taoism than with communism, personally. But it's always possible for a basically good movement or idea to get hijacked. And when you have these charismatic cult leader types pushing a good idea that's good in and of itself, they can turn it into something pretty nefarious.
Yeah, I mean, the devil would never be allowed into your house if he just said, "Hey, I'm the devil, let me in." There's always something very seductive and good that's used as a bit of honey to cover the poison. So yeah, I mean, it's subtle, but I think when you look at the change of behavior of Erdogan since shooting down the Russian jet and then writing his famous letter asking for forgiveness from Putin a few months later, and then like 2 weeks right after openly asking Putin for forgiveness for shooting down the Russian jet over Turkish Syrian airspace, which killed a Russian pilot, and almost invoked Article 5 of the Collective Security Pact of NATO, right? That was like almost World War III. 2 weeks after saying, "I'm sorry," you had the activation of this coup d'etat with networks of Gulen networks that had highly embedded themselves, kind of like a Fight Club scenario. It's weird, all throughout the administration, the government, the military, which luckily was put down through the help of the FSB, which provided some forward intelligence to Erdogan to get to safety, and the people sort of helped also put that down. But we saw that this was a completely Western organized attempted coup to bring Turkey back into place, to keep it, antagonistic to Russia the way it should be in the mind of some oligarchs. And
it's supposed to be just a colony of NATO.
Exactly, and since then, like Erdogan has gone a little bit renegade in a useful way by buying S-400s from Russia and increasingly trying to push back against some of these more nefarious power structures that have been sponsoring ISIS and other things. Idlib is still a big issue. Mm-hmm. But all that to say, Turkey's also moving east towards the Belt and Road Initiative and trying very desperately to be a part of the Middle Corridor, which is vital for their development pathway, as well as the North-South transportation corridor that Russia is building with India and Iran. That could feasibly move through Turkey and is vital for Turkey's survival. So there's these interesting dynamics, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, you've captured a lot of really good stuff, and I highly recommend that people who are kind of regular consumers of the Epoch Times and other sort of anti-CCP propaganda operations, which is really most of the mainstream and much of the alternative media today, they should really read your 3-part series just to get sort of the other view. and compare it with the stuff they're being force-fed all the time. And I actually wondered, to what extent not only the Epoch Times, obviously they're tolerated doing the kind of stuff they do because they're serving a kind of a CIA NATO function. And I wonder, how much of alternative media is steered in these ways. Is it easier to get an audience if you're in alternative media if you bash China, for example?
Yeah, I don't really know. It's sort of taken on a bit of a life of its own in the zeitgeist, but definitely there is, in alternative media, there's more willingness from an audience to think more seriously about the nature of conspiracies as an intelligible, investigatable thing than in the mainstream, which tends to never talk about that sort of thing. Maybe you can get allusions to it here and there, but not really. And so with that openness of mind to go there, so to speak, you can negotiate a discussion around, well, what is the causal agencies shaping this conspiracy? Because China did not create the Club of Rome, the depopulation agenda of the early 70s, right? That was what Kissinger was a part of. That Kissinger was the teacher of Klaus Schwab directly in Harvard. Maurice Strong, right, who was an asset for the British Empire. This man was a Rockefeller asset. He became the head of Power Corps. He was a privy councillor. He was the co-founder of the Club of Rome. He was the co-founder of the World Economic Forum as well. Maurice Strong, the guy who said it's the responsibility of world leaders to make industrial civilization collapse to save the environment. He's the guy who founded the IPCC, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so-called, in many ways the father of the Great Reset. These are people who were they getting their orders from China? Hell no. They wanted China to be the Morlocks in the, the H.G. Wellsian sort of world of the LOI, beautiful idiots and the Morlock dirty subhuman producer industrialists underground, but managed by a supranational Ubermenschen of more than humans above the ground, which is what you have with the transhumanist sort of cult, which a lot of these World Economic Forum, idiots, they all see themselves in this way of being the controllers of the new Darwinian evolution, or the new post-Darwinian evolution. That's people like Yuval Harari and Musk and they're all like that. But so China didn't
you've been
originate.
writing about those guys.
Yeah, and China didn't originate any of this stuff. They've been fighting against this and suffering and having to deal with their own internally organized deep state, which frankly has been there in its current form since the Opium Wars, when HSBC from London set up the international drug trade in a virulent way, which never went away. It still manages international drugs, HSBC, right? That's who's laundering most of the drugs today, and books have been written on this, as well as funding international terrorism. And they were set up to just, destroy China. And the triads as well, that's been a bane of China's existence, has been also a British imperial Freemasonic operation since the 1860s. It's an ongoing problem, and China's been trying to survive, and they're one of the only countries right now which is standing up and creating a functional alternative system of cooperation based upon some of the principles that the U.S. used to abide by when people like John F. Kennedy were alive. And that has since gone. And ironically, that is the water to put out the fire that's consuming our society into a one-world government dystopic dark age, is the help of China. We can't do it without them, which is why I'll just say I know we're hitting the end of our time here, but this is why Soros said the two greatest threats to his system is Xi Jinping's Belt and Road and Donald Trump's USA, because of the U.S.-China trade agreement, first phase, that was going into operation that very month that he was speaking at Davos in January 2020, which involved and Trump even said so for the months leading up to that the U.S., Russia, and China, he said that, should, instead of putting their money in weapons, should be putting all of this money into building projects together in the benefit of each other. So that's why they put so much effort into Russiagate, into trying 4 years to overthrow Trump. That's why they installed people like Bannon or later like Bolton as, different types of clash of civilization psychopaths into his world to basically control the policies, or Pompeo later on to initiate conflict with China. and it was going in a pretty positive direction until Wuhan. The Wuhan lab thing came up, and
okay,
all
and
of a
we
sudden,
only have about 30 seconds. So quickly,
yeah.
was this a bio attack on China, as Ron Unz thinks? Was it a depopulation Malthusian attack on the world, or both?
Both, but it's a fake thing. I don't think that COVID-19 is a real issue. I think it's a lot of it is like CO2 being demonized, which has nothing to do with temperature change. It was part of an operation to get a one world techno-feudalist solution. That's what I would say. But yeah, it's an attack on China too.
Okay. Well, we'll probably talk more about that down the line as more information on that emerges, and there's always a lot more to talk about. But yeah, I appreciate your great work. Matt Ehret, keep up the amazingly prolific work. I'm really impressed at the amount of high quality stuff that you're turning out.
Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, take care. It's Matthew Ehret. I'm Kevin Barrett. The website is truthjihad.com. You can find False Flag Weekly News there. I broadcast every Saturday morning, 11 to noon Eastern Time. False Flag Weekly News. That's coming up in 12 hours or so from now. So until the next radio show or until False Flag Weekly News, see you either tomorrow or next week.